So these are the main key points for the area. We see an increase in nitrogen concentrations in both streams and in groundwater, particularly in the south of the zone, in Silver Stream, Ohoka, but also in this general area too. We see a decrease in sediment and E. coli getting into the streams, and we put this down to the effect of fencing. I'm going to talk about Plan Change 5 and permitted activities and how they could offset any gains from the nutrient management. Climate change will have an effect on land and water, and we'll discuss a few of those things as we're going through. Population is expected to increase, and this is of course going to affect the social economic well-being of the zone. And the last point is many of the streams in the river in this zone do not currently sustain cultural values, and under this scenario there's nothing to improve those cultural values. One point I should probably make for those of you that aren't familiar with this process is that we actually cover environmental, social, cultural and economic processes, and if you note the community outcomes, they actually cover those four broad ranges too. So a bit of background. So the purpose of the scenario is to provide information to people so you can make informed decisions around how you manage land and water in this zone. And as I said before, the current pathways is designed to explore what would happen if we carried on our current trajectory. Again, we use our best estimates and available information, and I think the last point is really critical. We're here to get your feedback. You know, we don't have all the answers, and we're actually seeking your input into this process and how we develop these solutions going forward. I think it's important to acknowledge that this is really complex. It can be hard to understand. There's lots to it. What I'm about to kind of show you is quite comprehensive, and it can be quite difficult to follow. But leading on from that complexity, I guess in terms of solutions, there is no right answer. There are a multitude of ways that you could cut this pie. And I guess the purpose of it is to balance those multiple values to find the best way of managing land and water in this district. Because of the implications of the things we're talking about tonight, there often is a lot of tension around the table, and that's perfectly fine. And it often happens when we're developing or talking generally about these types of contentious issues with people. So there have been a number of other zones that have gone through this process, and one of the philosophies that came out to be really useful was this philosophy of gifting and gaining, of listening and learning and understanding from others. It's one of the principles that allow us as a group to move forward and to develop some solutions. So that kind of wraps up the background, and the next few slides, what I'm going to talk about is the key elements of the current pathway scenario. And again, just to re-emphasize that it is one scenario, and within that scenario we've had these different phases. And the reasons that we've had them separately is to give you some sense of what the biggest driver might be. All right. So the first one we'll talk about is nutrient loads in the post. So this diagram is a conceptual model that a colleague of mine created, and it's a cross-section through the Canterbury Plains from the hills down to the oceans. So it's actually of Christchurch, but it's absolutely applicable to the other side too. At the coast you get an interfingering of fine-grained and gravelly sediments. The gravelly sediments are more permeable, and that's where you get a lot of your groundwater. Inland, as you go towards the hills, it becomes more dominated by just gravels. When you get rain or flows from rivers, it infiltrates through the soil and it recharges your groundwater system. The reason I show this particular diagram is to make one point. So we've got a couple of yellow arrows up there. So there's one down by the Avon and one up by the plains. And if you can imagine, if we had a rainfall event and we had a couple of drops of water infiltrate at those 2 points, the one closest to the Avon, let's just say it takes 10 years for that drop of water to travel through the groundwater system and up to the spring-fed streams. And for argument's sake, the one further inland, it takes 60 years to travel through that groundwater system and up and to that same point. That means that when this first drop of water has reached the surface, this one's only a sixth of its way through its journey. And I guess what we're trying to demonstrate is that groundwater takes a long time to travel, and at that spring-fed streams, you might get a mix of water of varying ages. Okay, so that wee introduction is kind of moving on to when we're talking about the lag to come or the load to come, we're talking about nitrogen and groundwater. And we know that it takes a long time for groundwater to move and for it to travel through the system. And we know that when we measure water in those spring-fed streams, for instance, that doesn't reflect the current land use. And we also know that a lot of that source of that nitrogen in the Waimakariri zone comes from agricultural sources, particularly cow urine patches and fertiliser and etc. The other thing we know is that irrigated area and land use has intensified in this zone over time. So this is a graph showing time on the bottom axis and area of irrigated area on the other axis. So we've used consensus data to estimate this area. So there are some uncertainties around it, but it does show a clear trend through time. If you were to take the year 2000, for instance, from that point to now, the amount of irrigated area in this zone has essentially doubled. So we've used this information in our modelling to show that we expect nitrogen to increase through time. So there is a stream on the southern side down by the Waimakariri called Silver Stream, and it is, actually I'll step back, there's a national guidance policy called the National Freshwater Management Policy Statement, and in that it has some thresholds about concentrations of nitrogen in streams and what is acceptable and not. The Silver Stream, the lowest, the national bottom line for streams is 6.9, and currently that stream is beyond that. So the last time it's been sitting around anywhere between 8 and 11 milligrams per litre. Under our modelling and extrapolating into the future, we expect that Ohoka and Cuss Main Drain in the south of the area will also breach that national bottom line. So a lot of this is concentrated lower down from your higher permeable soils inland at those spring-fed streams, but we also see changes elsewhere throughout the catchment. For instance, Taranaki Stream, an average from 0.6 to 2.6 over time. With this increase in nitrogen, we also believe that there'll be an increased risk to drinking water. So the drinking water standard in groundwater is 11.3 milligrams per litre, in water, full stop. And we believe that particularly in that southern part of the region, that there'll be a risk to drinkable water and that some water supplies will go beyond that threshold. The biggest cause of the change in nitrogen is from that lag to come, from that groundwater, from those loads that are already in the water and actually coming towards the streams. So this poses some real challenges for any potential solutions out there. So we have, you have a range of options that you can use to solve these types of problems, either change the input source or add dilution to a stream or a combination of both of them. So the next few things I'll talk about is testing the planning provisions, and again, this is all taken into the single scenario. So the first one is the stock exclusion, and then I'll talk a little bit about Plan Change 5 after that. So in the Land and Water Regional Plan now, there is a rule that states that farmed cattle, deer and pigs are prohibited in the beds and banks of spring-fed plains, rivers and inanga habitat. So inanga being whitebait, of course. So we've used these estimates and projected that forward to see what that effect might have. And we've also taken into account things such as sustainable dairy accord where, for instance, there are approximately 100 Fonterra farms in the region, and about 98% of them are fenced at the moment. So the areas we're talking about is in the lower catchments. This is the spring-fed plains rivers, generally in this area. Hopefully you can make out the purple shaded area along the coast is the inanga spawning areas. So when we've assumed full compliance with this rules and extrapolating out other interventions such as the dairy accord, and generally what we find, going the wrong way, is an overall positive effect on stream health and recreational values. So what do I mean by that? So the fencing, we've assumed a 1 metre setback of the fencing, and the fencing stops your larger animals causing erosion of the bank and that sediment getting into the streams. And it also stops animals actually defecating directly into the streams. So you get a positive effect for both the stream health and the recreational values. But it's not going to solve everything. There's still some issues. From the current state documents, which are online and we can provide a link to you later, one of the biggest drivers for degraded stream health in this zone was sediment. And what that sediment does, particularly when it's in the stream, it covers the base, the cobbles, and that smothers the habitat for your invertebrates and the alike, and the invertebrates are being fed upon by the fish. So there's still an issue about the sediment on the bed of the river already in there. And the other issue, of course, is after really heavy rainfall, you get this overland flow of water and sediment moving to the stream. But to just re-emphasise, this is actually, assuming this full implementation of the rule, this is actually quite a good improvement for these streams. So the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk about Plan Change 5, and I'm talk about two different pieces of work. So the first one is looking at applying, so the industry went out and defined what is a good management practice relating to water quality. Environment Canterbury has taken those rules and put it into a plan. So we've tested what the implications of that are, and then we've looked at the permitted activity rules relating to the same plan change. So for the good management practice, we have used the current planning rules, and we have assumed that all properties in the district operate at this good management practice. We then modelled the current land use and current water use, and just to emphasise, when we do that modelling, we take into account variations in soils and climate, and then we use best available information to estimate the difference between current losses and losses under GMP. And on average, there's a 15% reduction on average across all the industries, but it does vary by industries. So the result of this modelling shows that overall you do see a reduction in nitrogen. However, it comes with less drainage. So if you are here for current state meetings, my colleague Zeb discussed that a lot of the streams, particularly in these general area here, the flows have actually increased after the Waimakariri Irrigation Limited. So this has the potential to reduce some of that flow-on effects to those streams in terms of water quantity. Are there any questions on that? So the other piece of work that we did was look at the permitted activity rules around PC5. So a permitted activity means that you can do this activity without the need of a consent. So there are different rules in the red and orange zones. And the rules relate around irrigated area and winter grazing for cattle. So for instance, if you're in an orange zone, you can irrigate up to 50 hectares, assuming you've got a water take and you've got available water, or 20 hectares of winter grazing of cattle. What we did was assume that every property that could intensify under those particular frameworks, so you're going up to the 50-20, did. And what this does is define what's effectively being allocated under this framework. Does that kind of make sense? Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay. So what we found was that what this did was it offset any gains from good management practice, but it also had a couple of other flow-on effects. So a lot of the changes in the nutrients, so the nutrients will increase under these PA rules, and it was driven by an increase in winter grazing of cattle, but also we've assumed increased irrigated area in Kowai, Ashley and Cuss zones. There's a groundwater allocation zones, and there's some details in the planning map about those. We use those zones because there's available allocation available, and we also went on to show that increased irrigated area would have impact on well reliability or existing water users in those areas, and flow-on effects to spring-fed streams, so a decrease in stream flows. So this is a sensitivity analysis around these rules, and it showed that the PC5 permitted activity rules will show a decrease over time. Okay, so the next one we went on to is population growth. So we've drawn extensively from the information from the Waimakariri District Council, and this map here is from one of their infrastructure strategies. So the grey areas are the existing urban areas. The dashed black line is the boundaries of infrastructure, and the green and blue are priority areas for growth of residential and business areas. So Stats New Zealand have estimated as of 30th of June 2016, the current population of the Waimakariri district is about 57,600. Depending on which estimate you use, the Waimakariri District Council are currently using estimate of at 2048, something around 80,000 people in the district, which equates to about 10,000 more households. It's expected that a lot of this growth can be incorporated within these greenfield areas, within the existing infrastructure boundaries. And of course, an increase in population has flow-on effects for the economy, greater retail potential, and of course someone has to build these houses. So this is the last element of the scenarios. And then we'll get into the evaluation proper. So climate change, we've assumed, we've looked out to 2040, and we've drawn on a lot of data from NIWA, and we've used that in our tools where appropriate. But there are things that we can't model, and therefore we've used the assumptions and the results from others. In a general sense, there's a website here on the MFE website which has a really nice summary of the effects of climate change by region. But generally, we're expecting a temperature increase that's 0.7 to 1 degrees, and an extreme and windy days by 2090 by about 2 to 10%. So the increase in temperature and wind, of course, gives you greater evaporation, and it also drives greater demand for water. There's a decrease in snowfall, particularly in the Alps, and this will have a flow-on effect for the Waimakariri river flows. In terms of rainfall, the biggest change is a seasonal effect in terms of less winter rainfall and more summer and autumn rainfall. And of course, associated sea level rise at the coast. Generally though, more variability. So the predictions are more extreme rainfalls, more severity and frequency of droughts, hot days, decrease in cold nights. And these all have implications, of course, for how water is managed in this zone.